Something vanished from my house. The locks were untouched. The rooms were quiet. My husband was already gone. The disappearance happened after the burial. No police report was filed. No questions were asked. Then my phone rang. I answered, and I understood why. My name is Janet. I am 60 years old. I am a Black American woman. I have lived a long life watching people mistake my silence for weakness. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard, and drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. Morning after my husband's funeral, I walked through the house the way I always did, slow, steady, noticing what stayed the same and what felt lighter than it should have. The air still holding his absence, the floors remembering his steps. Then I reached the study and stopped because something that had always been there was no longer waiting for me. Not broken, not misplaced, simply removed with intention. I stood still long enough to realize this was not grief playing tricks on me, because grief adds weight. It does not erase objects. And as I traced the empty space with my eyes, memories of my husband's quiet habits pressed in. How he never moved a thing without reason. How he believed some items were not meant to be displayed, but guarded. And while the house stayed silent, my mind moved fast, counting who had keys, who had visited, who had lingered too long after the service, who spoke softly but watched closely. And just as I reached for the phone to call my son, it rang in my hand first, an unfamiliar number. A pause before I answered, and a voice on the other end that did not ask how I was doing, did not offer condolences, but spoke as if the timing was already planned, as if my husband's death had opened a door they had been waiting beside. In that moment, I understood this loss was not finished yet. It had only begun, because what vanished from my house was never meant to leave quietly. And the call was not a question. It was a warning, one that told me the truth was already in motion. And someone believed I was too late to stop it. The voice on the phone said my name once, slow and certain, then told me to sit down before I heard anything else. And I did, not because I was weak, but because I have learned that people who give instructions during moments like that believe they already have control. And I wanted to hear what they thought they owned. And as I lowered myself into my husband's chair, one he never let anyone else use, the voice continued without pause, saying the item missing from my study was no accident, no mistake, no act of grief. It was retrieved, that word chosen carefully, as if it had never belonged to me at all. And when I asked who was speaking, the answer came too fast. A family friend, someone who had helped my husband handle things, someone who spoke as if my husband were still alive and had simply stepped out of the room. And then they said my husband left instructions, not written, not filed, but understood. Those instructions were activated the moment he died. And I felt something cold settle in my chest because my husband was a careful man. He believed secrets only stayed safe when fewer people knew them. Yet here was a stranger speaking with confidence about his intentions, about my house, about what no longer sat on the shelf behind his desk. And as the call went on, I walked through the study with the phone pressed to my ear, noticing details I had ignored before. The faint outline where the object once stood, the dust disturbed near the safe, the drawer that did not close as smoothly as it used to. And the voice told me not to worry, that the item was secure, said it was better this way, said my husband wanted to protect me from decisions I was not prepared to make. And that sentence stayed with me because my husband never believed in shielding me from truth. He believed in preparing me for it. And when I asked why no one told me before now, the answer came after a pause, the first pause of the call, because grief makes people unpredictable, and they wanted to wait until I settled, until I accepted his absence, until I was ready to cooperate. And when the call ended, it did not end with comfort or closure. It ended with instructions on what not to do next. And as I placed the phone down on my husband's desk, I realized the house was not just missing an object anymore. It was missing the protection my husband quietly provided. And whoever took what vanished believed his death had transferred that protection to them. A belief I did not correct, because sometimes the most dangerous move is letting someone think you agree, especially when they do not yet know what else my husband left behind. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because the house felt awake in a way it never had before. Every sound measured, every shadow placed. And as the hours passed, I walked from room to room, letting my steps echo just enough to remind myself that I was still here, that nothing had pushed me out yet. And when morning came, I made coffee the way my husband liked it, strong and plain, even though I would be the only one drinking it, because routine is a form of control. Control was something I refused to surrender quietly. And as I sat at the kitchen table, I opened the small notebook my husband kept hidden behind the old cookbooks, the one he used for thoughts he did not trust to paper that could be filed or copied. And inside were short lines, names without explanations, dates without context, and one sentence written darker than the rest. If anything is removed, do not react, observe. And reading that told me he knew this moment would come, that his death would loosen hands that had been waiting. And later that morning, my son arrived without calling first, standing in the doorway too long before stepping inside, his eyes moving through the house as if checking what was still in place. And he asked if I was holding up, his voice careful. And I told him I was managing, which was true, but not in the way he expected. And when he asked if anything felt off, I watched his face instead of answering right away, saw the way his jaw tightened before he relaxed it. And I said only that the house felt quiet, and he nodded too quickly, as if relieved, and began talking about paperwork, about accounts, about things that would need signatures soon. And as he spoke, I realized the call from the night before had not come from outside my family's reach. It had come from someone who believed the timing was perfect, that grief would keep me distracted while arrangements were made. And as my son moved through the kitchen, opening cabinets he had no reason to open, I remembered how my husband once told me that loss makes people careless, not the one who loses, but the ones who think the loss gives them permission. When my son finally left, promising to check in later, I stood by the window, watching his car pull away, understanding that the object taken from my study was only the first move, and the call was only the signal. Now, the real test was not about what they took, but how long they thought I would stay quiet, because my husband did not raise me to protect what was visible. He prepared me to defend what people assume is already gone. By the third day after the funeral, people stopped checking on me and started checking around me, which is how you know sympathy has expired and interest has taken its place. And I let it happen, because watching is easier when you are not being watched back. And that afternoon, I went into the study again, not to search, but to confirm what I already knew, that the missing space was meant to pull attention, meant to make me restless, meant to rush me into asking questions out loud. And I refused to give that satisfaction, choosing instead to sit at my husband's desk and open the lower drawer he rarely used, the one that stuck unless opened a certain way. And inside were copies of documents that did not match what had been discussed at the funeral, older versions, handwritten notes in the margins, arrows pointing to names I recognized too well, and one name circled twice, someone who had stood beside my son during the service, someone who hugged me longer than needed. And as I read, I understood the item taken from the shelf was never valuable on its own. It was valuable because of what it proved, and removing it was meant to weaken a future I had not yet stepped into. Later that evening, my daughter-in-law called, her tone gentle, almost careful, asking if I planned to stay in the house long-term, or if I had considered something smaller, something easier to manage. And I told her the house still felt like home. And there was a pause on the line, just long enough to tell me she had hoped for a different answer. And she mentioned how my husband trusted certain people with certain matters, how it might be best to let those arrangements continue without disruption. And I listened without interrupting, because people reveal more when they think they are reassuring you. And after the call ended, I stood in the hallway looking at the family photos, noticing which faces smiled freely and which ones looked practiced. And I realized the disappearance was not meant to hurt me emotionally. It was meant to test me, see if I would challenge the story already being told in rooms I was no longer invited into. And that night, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I made a quiet decision not to recover what was taken right away, because the person who removes evidence always believes the danger has passed. And that belief creates the opening, one I planned to walk through carefully, because my husband did not leave me unprepared. He left me watching. The next move was already being made without realizing I was counting every step. The next morning began without noise, which felt deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath, and I moved through it slowly, touching familiar surfaces, grounding myself in what was still mine, because when people begin to take things without asking, they expect confusion to follow, and I refused to give them that advantage. By noon, I received an email from an attorney I had not spoken to in years, polite, formal, reminding me of a scheduled review my husband had requested months earlier, review that suddenly felt less routine and more strategic. And when I arrived at the office, I noticed how prepared they were for my questions, folders aligned, answers ready before I spoke, which told me they expected resistance, not silence. And as the meeting went on, I listened more than I talked, hearing how decisions had been temporarily adjusted, how certain responsibilities had been reassigned for efficiency, and how my husband's absence required smooth continuation, phrases chosen to sound reasonable while shifting control. And I asked only one question: when did these changes begin? The room grew still for half a second too long before someone answered, quietly, shortly after your husband's condition worsened. And that confirmed what my instincts already knew, that the vanishing object was not the start of this plan, it was the cleanup. And as I left the office, I did not confront anyone, did not correct the assumptions forming in their minds, because confrontation closes doors, and I needed them open. And back at home, I found a package waiting at the door. No return address. Inside, a copy of a document I recognized immediately, altered, missing signatures, missing authority, but still carrying my husband's name. And I understood then that someone wanted me to see how much had already been rewritten, wanted me to feel behind, wanted me to rush. And instead, I sat down and read it twice, noting every absence, every inconsistency, every confidence built on the idea that grief makes people forgetful. And as evening settled in, my phone buzzed again. Same unfamiliar number. No greeting this time. Only a reminder that cooperation would make things easier. I thanked them for the concern before ending the call, because ease was never my goal, clarity was. And as I placed the phone beside my husband's notebook, I saw the final line I had overlooked before, written smaller than the rest. They will move fast when they think you are slow. And I realized the next step would not come quietly. It would come with pressure, with urgency, with a demand for an answer I was not ready to give, because the moment I responded was the moment the real consequences would begin. By the 7th day after my husband's funeral, the house no longer felt like mine, yet I refused to let it belong to anyone else. Every room held a memory, every piece of furniture a warning, and I moved through them deliberately, as if testing who might be watching, who might be listening. Missing object still haunted the study, but I no longer sought it. It was never about retrieving what was taken. It was about understanding why it was gone. My daughter-in-law arrived unannounced that afternoon, her voice polite, measured, asking casual questions about my schedule, about when I planned to leave the house for errands. But her eyes scanned the walls, the shelves, and the space behind my husband's desk. I answered her carefully, giving information that seemed harmless while observing her every gesture, every hesitation, every glance that lingered too long. Later, I received another call from the same unknown number, but this time the tone had changed. It was quieter, insistent, implying that the disappearance was only the beginning, that more shifts were happening quietly in my absence, that the control I assumed I had might already be slipping. I listened without panic, letting the words sink in slowly, feeling the house grow heavier with each sentence. That evening, I went back to the study and opened the drawers I had ignored before, finding small notes, receipts, and markings I had overlooked, all pointing to people I trusted less than I thought, to decisions being made without my knowledge, to plans that assumed I would not notice. I did not call anyone, did not demand answers. I had learned the danger of showing urgency to those who hope you will react before you understand. Instead, I sat quietly, letting the realization settle. The theft, the calls, the rearrangements, all were testing me, probing my limits, challenging my patience, and I understood for the first time that my husband's absence did not make me powerless. It made me invisible, and invisibility is a weapon when used carefully. As night fell and the house grew silent, I traced my fingers along the edge of the desk where the item had been, noting the space like a wound that had not healed. And I knew the next move would not come openly, would come disguised as help, as caution, as courtesy, and whoever made it would not expect the quiet patience of someone who has already seen the first layer of betrayal. I leaned back in the chair, letting the tension settle into a plan forming in my mind. Because the darkness that had entered my house after my husband's death would not last if I moved carefully, and I had already decided I would watch, wait, and act when they least expected, because those who take what is not theirs always underestimate the one who remains calm. The morning after my daughter-in-law left, I walked through the house again, not out of routine, but to measure the weight of absence, to notice what had shifted since my husband's passing. Because objects are not the only things that vanish, certainty does too, and I could feel it slipping around me. The study, where the item had been taken, seemed quieter than usual, yet every drawer and shelf held traces of movement, small disturbances that told me someone had been there. Carefully, intentionally, I sat at my husband's desk, tracing the grain of the wood, remembering the last time he had run his hands over it while speaking about responsibility and trust. And I realized he had prepared me for more than grief. He had prepared me for deception. My phone rang, the same number, no greetings, no preamble, just instructions. Listen, it said, not all things are as they appear. I held the phone to my ear, letting the words sink in, while my eyes roamed the room, seeing shadows where none should exist, hearing faint echoes of steps I did not take. They wanted me to react quickly, to question, to panic, but I did none of that. Instead, I made a note in my husband's small, hidden notebook, marking names, times, and hints that had always been easy to miss if you were too impatient. By noon, the lawyer called, speaking carefully, referencing meetings that had been scheduled without my knowledge, transfers that were necessary for efficiency. And I felt the weight of unseen hands moving my life in directions I had not yet consented to. I stayed calm, asking only clarifying questions, listening to the pauses, noting the phrases that implied urgency but revealed insecurity. Later, I walked the halls of my house, noticing which rooms felt lighter, which corners seemed watched, which spaces now held tension I could almost touch. And I realized that the theft, the calls, the rearrangements, they were a test. A slow push to see if I would move before I understood, if I would surrender control without seeing the full picture. As night fell, I sat at the desk once more, the empty space behind me like a reminder that power is often unseen, that patience is more dangerous than force, and that the people orchestrating these moves believed I was too predictable, too slow, too naive. And I smiled quietly to myself, because their assumptions had never been more wrong. I would wait, and when the moment came, I would act, not with haste, but with the clarity that only comes from watching the first layer of betrayal unfold completely before deciding the next step. By the ninth day, the house felt like a stage where every movement was being observed, and I moved carefully, testing what remained mine and what had been quietly claimed by others. The missing object was no longer simply a thing. It had become a signal, a message that someone believed my husband's absence made me weak, that my silence meant submission. That morning, a delivery arrived at the door, an envelope with no return address, heavy in my hand, sealed tightly, and inside were copies of contracts I had already signed, yet altered, each page hinting at decisions made without my consent. I studied the handwriting, the slight differences from the originals, the way signatures were placed just enough to seem authentic, and I realized someone had assumed my attention would be distracted by grief, that I would not notice the changes until it was too late. Later, my son called, casual at first, asking if I wanted lunch delivered, but I noticed how his tone carried undercurrents, how questions seemed ordinary but had hidden tests. Did I know what had changed? Did I suspect? Would I act? I answered calmly, noting the pauses in his speech, the careful phrasing, because those who manipulate most expect you to reveal panic before clarity. As I walked through the study again that afternoon, I found small discrepancies I had ignored before. A book slightly shifted, a paper edge curling differently, the faint outline of the item that had vanished, reminding me that absence leaves traces, and traces reveal intent. Another call came that evening, the voice softer this time, almost polite, yet the words carried weight. They were not threats, not openly, but suggestions disguised as guidance, instructions on what I should or should not do. And I felt the tension settle deep in my chest, knowing that patience was now a weapon I had to wield carefully. Sitting at the desk, I made a list, not of names, but of movements, times, and patterns, because the only way to regain control was to understand the rhythm of those who thought they had already taken it from me. And as the night darkened, I realized the game was no longer about retrieving what was taken. It was about proving that silence, observation, and calm can be far more powerful than panic. And when the next move came, I would be ready to respond in a way no one could anticipate, because those who act too soon always reveal more than they intend. And I had learned to watch, wait, and remember every detail. By the 10th day, the house carried a silence that felt deliberate, heavy, as if it were holding its breath and waiting for me to make the first move. And I moved through it slowly, letting my steps mark time, observing the air and noting what had shifted in my absence. Missing object, once just a curiosity, had become a measure of how far people were willing to go, a proof of their audacity. And I realized they were testing boundaries more than taking things. They wanted to see if grief could make me careless, if loss could make me compliant. That morning, I received a call from a number I did not recognize, the voice on the line calm but firm, stating facts without explanation. Instructions delivered with quiet authority. Observe, do not interfere. Wait for further notice. And as I listened, I walked slowly through the study, touching surfaces lightly, noticing the outlines of the space where the item had once rested, the small disturbances left behind, each one telling me who had been here and what they assumed about me. Later, my son came again, polite, careful, speaking about routine matters. But I noticed his hands fidgeting, his eyes darting to corners he believed I was too distracted to notice. And I let him talk while I observed, because control is often in watching rather than acting. In the evening, another envelope arrived at the door, this one heavier, filled with papers that were real but incomplete, carrying authority that belonged to me, but presented as though I had agreed to it. And I sat at my husband's desk, reading each page, noting what was missing, what had been rewritten, and where assumptions had been made about my passivity. And I felt no fear, only the clarity that comes when you see the first layer of deception fully exposed. I made notes in the hidden notebook my husband kept, marking times, changes, and possible motives, mapping the movements that had begun as soon as his funeral ended, because I understood now that the missing item, the calls, the altered documents, they were all pieces of the same plan, and the people behind it believed I would act too soon, that I would panic or plead, but I would not. And as night settled over the house, I traced the empty space with my eyes one last time before leaving the study, knowing that patience had become my greatest weapon, and that the next move in this quiet war would arrive with a pretense of care. And when it came, I would be ready. By the 11th day, I realized the house itself had become a silent observer, recording movements, choices, and reactions. And I moved deliberately through every hallway, every room, measuring what had changed since my husband passed. Because absence does not just remove presence, it shifts power. That morning, a knock came at the door, soft but deliberate. And when I opened it, no one was there. Only a small envelope placed carefully on the welcome mat. Inside were papers with my husband's signature, but faintly altered, missing key dates, missing instructions I remembered clearly. And I understood immediately that someone had assumed I would not notice, that grief would blur memory, that absence would make me careless. Later, the phone rang again, same unknown number, same calm tone, delivering instructions in short, clipped sentences. Observe patterns, trust no one outside your home, verify before reacting. And I let the words settle while walking through the study, noting details that had escaped my attention. The way the carpet fibers were disturbed, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the faint mark where the object had once rested. My son arrived that afternoon, cheerful in voice, but stiff in posture, and I watched him carefully, noticing which words were practiced, which movements were rehearsed, the subtle way his eyes scanned the room as if testing my reaction. And I allowed him to speak, revealing more than he realized, because people underestimate the insight of calm patience, the understanding that comes from observing without interruption. That evening, another delivery arrived, heavier this time, a box containing items that had once been part of my husband's private collection. Some of them shifted, some replaced, some clearly handled by someone attempting to assert control. And I studied each piece quietly, making notes in my husband's hidden notebook, noting discrepancies, recording times, mapping movements, because understanding the pattern was more powerful than rushing to recover what had been taken. As night fell, I walked through the halls again, feeling the weight of absence and presence simultaneously, realizing that every action, every move, every call, and every small theft had been designed to test me, to see if I would panic, to measure my patience. And I knew then that the missing item was only the beginning, a signal, and the next move would come cloaked in civility, cloaked in concern. And when it did, I would be ready, because calm observation had become my shield, my weapon, and my advantage. And I would not be the one who acted first in a game designed to mislead. By the 12th day, the rhythm of the house had changed completely. Silence was no longer empty. It was weighted, expectant, almost accusatory. And I moved carefully through every room, noting which spaces felt altered, which objects had shifted, and which corners seemed to hold whispers of someone else's presence. That morning, a subtle creak in the study caught my attention, though nothing was visibly disturbed, and I realized the missing item was not the only thing taken. It was my sense of certainty, my quiet control, and the adjustments being made around me were deliberate, a test of patience and perception. Later, a call came from the unknown number, the voice calm, almost soothing, instructing me to verify what you can, do not interfere, and wait for the right moment. And I listened without reaction, understanding that words alone were a tool to gauge response, to see if fear or urgency would betray my awareness. My daughter-in-law arrived again, polite, bringing small questions and minor tasks. But I noticed the careful timing, the way she lingered near the rooms where the missing item had been, how her eyes traced the edges of shelves and drawers, and I said nothing more than necessary, letting her reveal intentions through her own caution. In the afternoon, I revisited the safe my husband had insisted I keep hidden, checking for signs of tampering, noting scratches that were barely visible, understanding now that the theft had not been random, that whoever had removed the object believed they could act without discovery, that they had underestimated the quiet persistence of someone who watches closely. By evening, a new envelope appeared at the door, heavier than before, filled with documents partially signed, altered, implying authority that I had not granted. And as I read through them, comparing to the originals, I realized the game had escalated. This was no longer just about the missing object. It was about control, about testing how I would respond to incremental loss. And I wrote notes in my husband's notebook, marking patterns, timelines, and subtle clues that revealed motives. As night settled, I walked the halls again, tracing the places that had been disturbed, touching surfaces lightly, remembering how my husband had taught me that patience reveals the truth, that calm exposes those who act with greed. And I understood fully that the next move would be presented as help, as guidance, as normalcy, but it would carry intent. And when it came, I would respond with clarity and control, because every calculated absence, every silent instruction, and every altered document had taught me that the most dangerous people are those who assume you are unaware. And I was far from blind. By the 13th day, the quiet in the house was no longer comforting. It had become a presence, a reminder that I was being measured, watched, and tested at every turn. Missing object, once a curiosity, had transformed into a symbol of audacity, a marker of someone believing they could act without consequence. And I moved through the house deliberately, noting what had changed since my husband's passing, the slight tilt of a picture frame, a dust pattern disrupted, a drawer that closed a little differently, and each detail told a story of intrusion, planning, and expectation. That morning, the phone rang again, the same unknown number, the voice calm but firm, stating that the item taken was not lost, that it had been secured, and that my observation would determine what happened next. And I listened without revealing the weight the words carried, knowing that those who think they hold control often show it subtly, waiting for a reaction. Later, my son stopped by unexpectedly, cheerful but measured, asking about minor tasks, making notes as he moved through the rooms, and I observed quietly, seeing the tension beneath his smile, the subtle shifts in posture as he glanced at areas I knew had been disturbed. And I answered calmly, giving only the information necessary, because silence often teaches more than questions. By afternoon, another envelope arrived at the door, unmarked, containing documents with my husband's signature, but altered, suggesting decisions had been made in my absence, authority assumed rather than granted. As I reviewed each page carefully, I traced the discrepancies, noting times, names, and instructions that had been rewritten without my consent. Understanding that the people behind these moves believed grief would blind me to changes, and that the missing object was only the first step in a larger plan to manipulate, test, and control. That evening, I revisited the study, sitting at my husband's desk, tracing the space where the item had been, reviewing notes in his hidden notebook, connecting patterns, and mapping motives, knowing now that the next move would come disguised as assistance, as routine as concern, and I would not be deceived, because the silence, the absence, and the calm had taught me that the most dangerous actions are those executed quietly, under the assumption that the person being tested is unaware. And I understood fully that whoever had begun this chain of events believed they were ahead. But patience, observation, and deliberate strategy were weapons they had underestimated. And when the next step arrived, I would be ready to expose intention without haste, without error, and with control they could not imagine. By the 14th day, the house felt like it was holding its own breath, every room quiet, but full of subtle signs that someone had been here, observing, moving carefully, and leaving traces meant to be seen if I paid attention. That morning, I walked through the study slowly, noticing once again the space where the missing object had been, the faint dust outlines, the slight scratches on the desk surface, and I realized that whoever had taken it had been precise, intentional, confident that I would not notice the small details that reveal a plan. Later, the phone rang, the same unknown number, the voice calm, instructing me to maintain patience, to observe quietly, to trust no one outside the house. And I listened carefully, noting the tone, the pauses, the control in every word, knowing that those who attempt manipulation often reveal their intentions in the way they speak, in what they choose to leave unsaid. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law arrived, offering help with trivial household tasks, but her eyes scanned the rooms, lingering over areas I knew had been disturbed. And I let her speak, letting her actions and words expose assumptions, because the quiet observation I practiced revealed more than confrontation ever could. Evening, another delivery arrived, a thick envelope containing copies of documents, altered, missing key signatures, implying authority I had not granted. And I studied each line carefully, comparing it to the originals I had hidden, marking the differences, noting who had benefited, who had assumed control, and who had misjudged my attention to detail. I revisited my husband's hidden notebook, reading his notes again, tracing connections, seeing patterns in the movements, the calls, the deliveries, understanding fully that the missing object was never the goal. It was a test, a signal the first move in a longer game designed to measure my response, my patience, and my awareness. And I realized that my calm, deliberate approach was the counter to their assumptions. As night fell, I walked through the house once more, touching surfaces lightly, observing shadows, listening to the subtle creaks of the floor. And I understood that the next move would come cloaked in normalcy, disguised as routine or courtesy. And I would not be deceived, because those who underestimate quiet vigilance reveal themselves. And when the time came to act, I would do so with clarity and control, turning the assumption of my weakness into a trap they could not see coming. By the 15th day, I understood that the house was no longer just a home. It had become a map of intentions, a record of movement, and every small detail, every shifted object, told a story of someone trying to control what was never theirs to command. That morning, I walked through the study again, fingers tracing the edges of drawers, the faint dust outlines where the missing item had rested. And I realized it was never about the object itself. It was about authority, about testing if I would react before I understood, about measuring patience and observation. Later, the phone rang, the same unknown number, calm and precise, delivering instructions without emotion. Observe patterns, note discrepancies, remain steady. Act only when the situation is fully understood. And I listened carefully, absorbing each word while walking slowly through the rooms, watching shadows shift, hearing the faint creaks of the floor, noting which areas seemed more disturbed than others. And I realized the intruder believed that absence equals ignorance, that grief diminishes attention. But I had learned otherwise. My son visited that afternoon, polite, cheerful, carrying himself with a practiced ease, asking questions about small household matters, about schedules and routines. And I responded evenly, allowing him to speak, observing his gestures, his glances, the way his eyes lingered on spaces he assumed I was not aware of, because people reveal more than they intend when they believe their actions are unnoticed. By evening, a package arrived, heavy, unmarked, containing documents altered and unsigned, carrying implied authority. And I sat at my husband's desk, comparing each line to the originals I had stored securely, noting the omissions, the subtle adjustments, the manipulation embedded in plain sight. And I understood that this was not theft. It was a challenge, a slow test of my perception, of my composure, of my willingness to respond only when I had full understanding. I returned to my husband's hidden notebook, tracing patterns, marking timelines, connecting dots. And as night fell over the house, I realized that the next move would arrive disguised as normalcy, as assistance, as something benign, but it would carry intent. And when it came, I would be ready, because calm observation has more power than urgency. And those who believe patience is weakness are always the first to make mistakes they cannot recover from. And I would use that advantage quietly, deliberately, and completely. By the 16th day, I felt the weight of the house pressing in, a quiet reminder that absence has a sound, that silence can be filled with observation, and that every movement I made was now measured, mirrored, and tested by forces I could only sense, but not yet see. That morning, I walked through the study slowly, running my fingers along surfaces, noticing the faint disturbances left behind, the subtle dust shifts, the slight tilt of a paper, the invisible fingerprints that told a story of someone confident they could act without consequence. And I understood fully that the missing object was never simply an item. It was a message, a first move in a game meant to test my patience and perception. Later, the phone rang again, the same unfamiliar number, voice calm, controlled, delivering instructions. Watch, note, do not act. Let the situation unfold. And I listened carefully, mapping every pause, every choice of word, knowing that those who seek to manipulate often reveal their methods in the precision of speech, in the quiet insistence of guidance disguised as instruction. My son arrived that afternoon, courteous, smiling, speaking about trivial household matters. But I observed him with attention, noticing how his eyes lingered on areas where changes had been made, how his hands moved over surfaces, as if measuring, testing, assuming. And I let him speak, revealing more through his behavior than any words could tell, because calm observation exposes intention in a way confrontation never can. By evening, another delivery appeared, a thick envelope containing altered documents, copies of papers I had signed, missing key signatures, implying decisions made without my consent. And as I read carefully, noting every omission, every subtle rewrite, I realized the people behind these moves assumed my grief would blind me, that my silence would become submission, and that they underestimated the quiet resilience of someone who watches, waits, and records. I returned to my husband's hidden notebook, marking details, connections, and timelines, mapping a pattern of intrusion and intent. And as night fell, I walked through the halls again, touching surfaces lightly, listening to every creak, observing shadows where none should exist. And I knew the next move would come disguised, cloaked in routine, in courtesy, in civility. But I would not be deceived, because patience has its own power. The person who assumes they have control before the full picture is understood is always the first to be outmaneuvered. By the 17th day, the house had become a silent battlefield, where every creak, every shift of air, every small disturbance told me that I was being watched, measured, and tested. And I moved through it slowly, deliberately, noting which corners had changed, which surfaces carried faint traces of intrusion, and which areas had been carefully left untouched to lull me into false security. That morning, I returned to the study, my husband's desk bare, but for the faint outlines of the missing object, and I traced the space with my eyes, memorizing every mark, every dust pattern, every subtle indication that someone had been here with precision and purpose, confident that absence equals ignorance. And I had long since learned that assumption is a mistake. Later, the phone rang, the same unknown number, voice calm, controlled, stating facts without explanation, delivering instructions disguised as guidance. Observe patterns, verify information, remain calm, act only when fully prepared. And I listened carefully, letting the words sink in as I moved from room to room, observing light shifts, hearing floorboards settle, feeling the subtle tension in the air that spoke louder than any human voice. My son came by that afternoon, cheerful and polite, speaking of schedules, minor errands, and family matters. Yet I noticed the measured precision in his movements, the way his eyes scanned the rooms he assumed were mine, the way his tone tested my reaction, revealing more than he realized. And I let him speak, revealing himself fully through actions, because careful observation exposes intent more effectively than confrontation. By evening, another envelope arrived at the door, heavy, unmarked, filled with documents altered subtly, but clearly, carrying implied authority that belonged to me. And as I compared each line to the originals I had kept hidden, I mapped omissions, adjustments, and subtle manipulations, realizing that the missing object, the calls, the altered papers, all were parts of a larger plan meant to probe my patience, to measure my attention, to test whether grief would make me careless. I sat at my husband's hidden notebook, writing observations, connecting names, dates, and patterns, understanding fully that the next move would come cloaked as help, as routine, as concern, but it would carry intent, and I would not be deceived. Patience, observation, and quiet resilience were now my weapons. and those who assumed they controlled the game had already underestimated me. And when the next step came, it would reveal not my weakness, but their overconfidence in ways they could never anticipate. By the 18th day, the house felt like it had a pulse, subtle but constant. Each floorboard creak, each whisper of air, a reminder that absence does not erase presence, and that I was still very much in control despite the theft, the calls, and the documents that had been altered without my knowledge. That morning, I walked through the study slowly, my fingers brushing the edges of drawers and the surface of my husband's desk, noting the faint dust lines, the subtle scratches, the empty space where the missing object had once rested. And I realized fully that the item itself was never the goal. It had been a signal, a message to test boundaries, patience, and observation. Later, the phone rang again, the same unknown number, calm, measured, delivering instructions with precise brevity. Observe, do not act, record every detail, trust no one outside your home. And I listened carefully, letting the words sink in while noting patterns in the house, the shadows that shifted differently when I moved, the slight changes in furniture alignment, the quiet disturbances meant to provoke curiosity, to make me believe control had slipped. And I refused to respond with anything but observation. My son came that afternoon, his voice polite, his movements careful, questions seemingly innocent. Yet I watched him closely, noting the subtle tension in his gestures, the way he lingered near corners where alterations had occurred, the way he assumed I would not notice. And I let him speak freely, because observation teaches more than confrontation ever could. By evening, a package arrived at the door, heavier than before, containing copies of documents altered subtly, signatures missing, dates shifted, instructions rewritten, implying decisions had been made without my knowledge. And I sat at the desk, reviewing each line, marking discrepancies, noting names and times, connecting the dots that revealed intention and timing, realizing that this was not mere theft, but strategy, manipulation, and testing of my awareness. I returned to my husband's hidden notebook, tracing connections, mapping moves, analyzing motives. And as the night settled over the house, I understood fully that the next step would arrive disguised as normalcy, as assistance, or as routine. But it would carry intent, and I would not be deceived. Calm patience had become my shield and weapon, and those who assumed they controlled the situation had already underestimated the power of quiet vigilance. Because I was watching, I was learning, and when the final move came, it would reveal not weakness, but the overconfidence of those who believed I could be misled. By the 19th day, the house had become a map of every intrusion, every movement carefully measured, and I moved through it with a quiet awareness that each creak, each shadow, each faint disturbance was a message, a test of my patience, my attention, and my restraint. That morning, I returned to the study, sitting at my husband's desk, tracing the space where the missing object had once rested, noting every subtle mark, every dust pattern, every shift in light across the room. And I understood fully that the item itself had never mattered. It had been a signal, a marker to gauge my response. Those who thought they could act without consequence had underestimated the quiet vigilance of someone who watches carefully before acting. Later, the phone rang again, the same unknown number, voice calm, controlled, delivering instructions without explanation. Record details, observe patterns, remain steady, do not act prematurely. And I listened, noting not only the words but the pauses, the inflections, the subtle clues embedded in tone. Because those who attempt manipulation reveal more than they intend when they believe their authority is unquestioned. My son came that afternoon, polite, measured, speaking of daily matters, schedules, and family obligations. Yet I observed his every movement, the tilt of his head, the lingering gaze on areas of the house where changes had occurred, the careful placement of his hands. And I let him speak, revealing more through body language than words could ever convey. Because observation unmasks intent far more than confrontation ever does. By evening, another delivery arrived at the door, unmarked, containing documents altered subtly, missing key signatures, shifting authority that belonged to me. And I reviewed each line meticulously, noting what had been removed, rewritten, or implied, connecting patterns, times, and motives, and realizing that the missing object, the calls, and the rearranged papers were all part of a strategy meant to test me, to measure how I would respond to incremental control. I returned to my husband's hidden notebook, tracing movements, documenting patterns, connecting dots. And as night fell, I walked through the house again, observing shadows, noting faint disturbances, listening to the subtle sounds of a home alive with intent. And I knew fully that the final move would be presented as guidance, as care, as routine, but it would carry intent, and I would not be deceived. Calm patience had become my weapon, observation my shield, and when the next step came, it would reveal not my weakness, but the overconfidence of those who assumed I could be misled, because I had been watching all along, and now I was ready. By the 20th day, everything that had unfolded since my husband's death, the missing object, the calls from unknown numbers, the altered documents, the careful intrusions, the subtle tests of patience, had formed a pattern I could finally see clearly. And I moved through the house one last time that evening, tracing the familiar spaces with quiet certainty, noting every detail, every shift, every mark left behind, because understanding the full picture was more powerful than reacting too soon. That morning, the same calm, measured voice called again, delivering instructions in clipped sentences, urging observation, caution, and restraint. And I listened without haste, letting each word sink in, knowing fully that those behind this were testing me one final time, and that their assumptions about grief, distraction, and fear had always been their weakness. My son arrived later, courteous and seemingly innocent, asking about trivial matters, offering help. And I let him speak, observing every movement, every glance, every hesitation, because by now I knew that people reveal their intentions most clearly when they believe they are unnoticed. And his actions that day confirmed everything I had suspected. Confidence built on assumption, plans drawn without considering the quiet vigilance of someone who sees beyond the surface. That evening, a final package appeared at the door, unmarked, heavy, containing the altered documents, partial signatures, and evidence of decisions made without my consent. And I examined each line carefully, comparing it to the originals I had kept hidden, noting what had been added, removed, or misrepresented. And I finally understood that the missing object had been the opening move in a long game designed to test my awareness, patience, and composure. Sitting at my husband's desk, I traced the empty space where the object had once rested, and for the first time, I felt clarity, knowing that the patterns I had observed, the notes I had kept, and the patience I had exercised had revealed the full scope of intentions, motives, and miscalculations, and that the people who believed they could manipulate me had misjudged completely. As night settled over the house, I walked through the halls one last time, observing shadows, listening to faint creaks, acknowledging every disturbance, and I realized that the power of quiet vigilance, patience, deliberate observation had become my shield and my weapon, and that now, fully aware, I could act with precision, with control, and with certainty, because the ones who assumed I was powerless had already shown me their overconfidence, and I was ready, If you haven't done, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. It helps me to make more videos like this. Hope you loved my story. See you in next video. Goodbye.